Good evening, everybody. I am reporting live here from Washington, D.C. I am so excited to be able to host all of these wonderful, wonderful guests tonight on a virtual platform, which means that we got to host so many. And also, I don't know where everyone's tuning in from, but I imagine it's from beyond here in the DMV area. And no, that is not the Department of Motor Vehicles. That stands for DC, Maryland, Virginia out here. All right. So tonight's event is for It Came from the Closets, Queer Reflections. Queer Reflections on Horror. And so this was a particularly awesome title for us to bring on. As you know, it's spooky season, but queer horror, it's like year round, just like queerness. It's not just for Pride Month. And so tonight we're going to look through the lens of horror from Halloween to Hereditary, which I'm excited to hear about that maybe. Queer and trans writers consider the films that deepened, amplified, and illuminated their own experiences. As we all know, horror movies kind of hold a complicated space in the hearts of the queer community. Historically misogynist, usually homo and transphobic, but it's really open to subversive readings, and we're starting to really see a different or new kind of final girl, final person in horror. And I am going to stop talking so much and actually bring on our lovely, lovely contributors. And first up, I have Viet D, who goes by he, him pronouns. Viet was born in Vietnam and grew up in Colorado. He attended Johns Hopkins University and the University of Houston and currently teaches at the University of Delaware. His debut novel, After Disasters, was a finalist for the PEN/Faulkner Prize and released in 2016. And up next, we have Tucker Lieberman, who also goes by he, him. He is the author of the weird trans metafiction novel, Most Famous Short Film of All Time. Previously, he worked for a decade for an investment company. As he says, this was mostly not scary, but a little scarier in retrospect. He's frightened by pumpkin spice lattes, but not to say he wouldn't drink one. Just said sometimes things that are frightening are good. Originally from Boston, he now haunts Bogota, Colombia with his husband, sci-fi writer Arturo Serrano. And now we've got Caro Narby, who goes by they, them pronouns. They're a hobbyist writer based on the North Shore of Massachusetts. Their essays have been featured in Bitch, The Toast, and The Establishment, but they're currently focusing on writing fiction. You can explore their work more at caronarby.com, and we'll be posting everyone's information throughout the program for you all to see. Up next, we've got Addie Tsai, who goes by any and all pronouns. Addie is a queer, non-binary artist and writer of color. They collaborated with Dominique Walsh Dance Theater on Victor Frankenstein and Camille Claudel, among others. He has an MFA in creative writing from Warren Wilson College and a PhD in dance from Texas Women's University. She's the author of the queer Asian young adult novel, Dear Twin, Unwieldy Creatures. Dear Twin. Their adult queer biracial retelling of Frankenstein, Unwieldy Creatures, is out now from Jaded Ibis Press? ? Addie? Yeah? Awesome. So check that out if you're a fan. And last but not least, the person to kind of have brought a lot of you together and I imagine corralled a lot of the authors during the writing program is Joe Baptiste. He is the editor of It Came from the Closet, Queer Reflections on Horror, and co-editor of the anthology What's Your Exit? A Literary Detour Through New Jersey. His creative and pop culture writings appeared in Bomb, Vice, Backstage, Pop Matters, Southeast Review, North American Review, Narrative Northeast, BIA, Voices in Italian Americana, among others. He holds an MFA from New York University and MAT and BA degrees from Bard College and is currently the clinical associate professor in the expository writing program at NYU. Very exciting. In addition, he served as the site director and faculty for the Bard Prison Initiative. And with that, I'm going to leave you all in the very capable hands of our lovely guests.
Thank you. Hi, everybody. So good to see you all. Yeah. And good evening to everybody watching from home on their laptops or their tablets or their phones or whatever else, whatever other tiny screen that one can watch us from. It's so exciting to be together again because I think a year ago, we all participated in, there were so many events last fall, but there was the bomb roundtable and there was another great conversation with there are a few great conversations at multiple bookstore virtual events, and some in-person events and parties, and we really had so many opportunities to talk about It Came from the Closet and queerness and horror, and so I'm excited to sort of see where we are a year later and to celebrate the book. Although the celebrating and the partying has not really stopped since last year, which is great. But I have a question for everybody that actually I was thinking about something that Addie said last year. I think it was for the bomb roundtable. Addie, you had said that you felt like these days, if you were going to watch a horror movie, it had to be worth it. And I remember being so struck by you saying that it had to be worth it because I'm somebody who watches so much trash that I don't even think twice about what's there. But you had said that, that to endure, like it had to feel like there was something there, that it was in service of something. And I'm wondering if we can revisit that, thinking about the past year in which, I don't know, somehow things have gotten worse for us as a community, legislatively and nationally and internationally. And so I wonder, does it feel worth it to watch horror? Does it feel more necessary now, given what's going on, sort of on a day-to-day basis? The question's a little broad, but I think you know what I mean, yeah? We can start with that or not. Anybody
Yeah, I can start. Yeah, I think in the bomb interview, what I was trying to get at also is that I don't think I'm a traditional person to be in relationship with horror because horror is not really a comfortable genre for me. I say that knowing that I also have written a queer Frankenstein, so I feel like I feel like there's a lot of us that say this, right? Like I'm not really
Yeah,
into horror, but then we sort of have this relationship to horror, to gothic fiction that sort of comes out anyway.
right.
And I think for me, it's a really delicate balance because one of the reasons that horror can be difficult for me is that I'm a childhood abuse survivor, so violence was very much a part of like my formation as a person, and so that means that films that I think some people can see through the production of it, horror films, actually like incredibly terrify me and put me through a kind of, I would say, undesirable psychological duress. So for me, I want the movie to have earned my duress. um, yeah, so if it's, like Saw 300 or like something like that, some sort of kind of gratuitous use of horror tropes that put me through actually quite a lot of psychological stress that doesn't actually feel worth the experience that I go through. Now, you're not always going to know what that experience is going to be. Yeah, and I think us having this event, in the middle of the horrors that are happening in Gaza, like, we can't not sort of think about what place horror has, while real life horrors are happening across the world globally. So, but saying all that, I actually do think that one of the things that draws people to horror is that it actually externalizes the fears and experiences that they face,
Right.
that they experience internally. So I think that, it's a fine balance, but that's like also a really valuable reason that many of us go to this genre too, or this discipline. Yeah.
Right. Does anybody want to jump in and continue that?
So I'll chime in. I'm sort of with Joe in that I consume lots and lots of horror film content, and most of it is pretty dire,
Yeah.
right? But I think one of the reasons I'm able to do that, and this is sort of like the flip side of what Addie was just talking about, is that I think when for me, when I approach horror, it is from a lens, it's sort of like an I wouldn't say necessarily analytical lens, but I think that's how I that sort of tamps down some of the more challenging aspects of horror, right? You know, like the violence, oftentimes the brutality or cruelty, or even the nihilistic outlook that horror can sometimes have on the world and life, right? So and part of that process is sort of for me going through and saying, okay, yeah, this movie was about an ancient mummy that comes back to life and terrorizes, like stupid college teens. But is there something else that this movie is, maybe even unaware that it's exploring underneath that surface, right? So that's part of the appeal for me, is that it is looking for that little germ of an idea in these terrible, terrible movies. And to be frank, like oftentimes there is no idea. And, I look up after an hour and a half, I was like, oh man, I can't believe I just did that. But, that's also part of horror, right? It's being able to endure whatever horror is being placed in front of you, right? It's horror is like a challenge, right? And sometimes that challenge is like, can I really sit through another Children of the Corn sequel? And yes, I did. I
Yes, you
sat
did.
through all of them.
That's good. I'll jump in and say I used to watch a lot of horror, and these days I watch a bit less. I'm a bit choosier. I guess just because I feel the stress more, being more aware of all the violence that is in the world. It becomes harder to watch it as fiction, but it does play such an important role. I mean, the emotion of fear is just central to being human, and questions about monsters, about what lies at the border of imagination, narratives that are surprising because you think it's going to go in one direction, but because it's a monster, it's not going to follow a human narrative. So there's something there that that provokes us to imagine new possibilities, and I think all of that remains important for me personally.
Yeah.
I also really love horror, like in terms of like myself as a reader and a viewer. But similarly to Viet, I do tend to like intellectualize it, and it's something that I've actually recently been trying to fight in myself. Partly because I haven't written horror, I've written dark fantasy, but I am writing a horror novella, and so trying to like get in that sort of frame of mind as a storyteller. So trying to fight that kind of analytical sort of academic perspective that I have. Just for examples, my friends and I recently rewatched The Witch, and it's a movie that I've seen many, many times. I often rant against like the very common reading that folks had when it came out, that the ending is like somehow empowering. Every time we watch it, I rant against that. And one of my friends asked, what do you think the movie is about? And my response was, well, I think it's about white American culture. And like, on one hand, I do think that's true, but on the other hand, that's kind of a pretentious response, like, because what the film is really, what's happening on screen, what's happening to the characters is it's about like, what if you were stuck with your dysfunctional family and everything just fell apart and there was nowhere you could go? You're stuck in that dysfunctional family unit. It's very immediate. It's very visceral. What if these horrible things happened? And so I'm trying to get away from that more, as I said, kind of academic, analytical, like, it's about a Protestant American culture, and like get down into, what if you were stuck in the woods with your abusive mom? Like, that kind of immediacy that makes horror so universally affecting.
Yeah.
I'll just chime in that, like one of the hallmarks for, for nowadays for me, for that, what I would consider like a horror movie that's worth it, is the movie that sort of like lures me out of that analytical headspace and sort of like transports me into the film. And then, I'm something that sort of like hypnotizes me into or out of that academic headspace, right? And whenever a movie is able to do that, right, that's when I'm like, oh, okay, this did something to me, and now let's look back at it and let's check out what it did.
Yeah, I think horror movies, perhaps more than any other genre, sort of give the viewer the luxury of either looking for subtext or just completely thinking about it as text and nothing else. I always think about how my brother, who loved The Sopranos, and I love The Sopranos as well, right? We're Jersey Italians, and we're watching the show. He would always, say to me, like, "Yeah, this season's really good, but I don't know. It feels like it's trying to do something literary. I'm just here for the mob violence." He would always say that he just wanted it to feel like Goodfellas, right? And that when it went into Twin Peaks, he was always like, "I don't understand why they're doing this," right? And he knew they were doing something, but he wasn't really interested in exploring it because he just didn't care, right? And I think that's okay. I think that's fine. But I always thought it was so funny, and I think that it certainly translates to horror movies. There are some who just don't care. Like I've been on like a tear grieving this new Exorcist movie because I think it's so terrible. And I know some people just don't care, and they just think it was fine. It was like any other, sort of Exorcist possession movie that that we've seen the last 20 years. I'm like, that's exactly the problem, right? Like The Exorcist is so special, and then we have this terrible sequel, and apologies, I won't spoil anything. There's nothing to spoil. It's just not a very good movie. That's the big surprise. And so I think about that, and I guess I'm trying to like resist my urge to get combative or something, and I'm sort of internalizing when I'm disappointed by horror instead of having to sort of vomit it out on people, right? That's what like a Reddit message board is for. It's not to do to your friends, right? But I think that horror gives us that choice in a way that I think a lot of other genres don't, right? Because if like a comedy is just not funny at all, then most people are not going to laugh, right? I mean, some people might, but you might not get scared by a horror movie, but you might find that there's something else kind of perfect and affecting in it, right? Yeah, so I'm not sure where I'm going with that, but I'm thinking that I too am probably also trying to like separate those two selves when I'm watching horror. And I think I do it naturally. Like sometimes you just sort of enjoy something like Children of the Corn, 8, that's actually a prequel, right, to the original movie or something like that. And or these like spiritual sequels that are happening. And, there's just so much recycled story stuff. But if I can jump a bit, that leads me to my next question that I have. It's something that I asked last year, and it was one of my favorite questions, and maybe not fair that I didn't prepare everybody for it, but maybe you remember it from something. I was wondering if, and this is, Addie will have to think of something else, but if there was an existing horror property that you would love the chance to queer in some way, to write a queer retelling or reimagining, or if there was something that you just think is ripe for a queer reimagining, like it's there, like it's, the subtext and the text are kind of, spilling over into each other in such a way that you can't believe that nobody has, picked it up and done a queer retelling of it. What might that be?
I'm remembering Tales from the Crypt. And I'm remembering those shorts. I used to rent them on VHS. And I'm not immediately remembering any short that was explicitly gay. There might have been one. I just don't remember. But I feel like that.
There were some transphobic ones for sure. I remember a few. Yeah.
Yeah. Those might not have been on my VHS rentals when I was a kid, but
maybe not.
Yeah, the format was just campy, and I feel like something could be done there.
Yeah, we got to petition Max, formerly HBO, to get those on there. For some reason, they don't have the Tales from the Crypt episodes.
I'll jump off of Tucker, and I'll add that on AMC/Shudder, they have a new Creepshow series, which is actually you know, with being shorts, it can be hit or miss. But I think this most recent season that just came out was actually pretty solid, right? It goes a little deeper than the traditional, Tales from the Crypt cheap show, creep show thing, where it's just like sort of a short morality tale, right? Like a 15-minute morality tale. So I'll just put a little plug in for Creep Show. And it also has the campy sort of like, visual style of the comic book that the original Creepshow also had. So, that's always very pleasant.
I used to love that original Creepshow film. I used to watch it with my dad all the time. Such an interesting cast too. It had Leslie Nielsen, right, and Ted Danson and Adrienne Barbeau, and then there was the sequel that had the story with the raft. Remember that one where they're all on the raft and there's like a blob tar creature that's coming up through it? That's great. Yeah.
I think
that
was
also had that horribly racist, Indian wooden Indian.
Yes. I remember that vividly. Cara or Addie, is there any sort of existing horror story that feels ripe for queering?
I had two ideas. One maybe is cheating, which is the Guadagnino Suspiria, because it's already like quite queery, but I feel like just take it all the way over to Sapphic land. And in that regard, I think also The Descent, if it wasn't so focused on like the cis man betrayal and like ended sort of like lesbian love story between the one betrayed and the one in relationship with the affair, I think could be actually like really interesting too.
Yeah, that's one where it's sort of that subtext is kind of like bouncing off the cave walls, right, the whole time, and then the sequel doesn't go there, like, right, like it's got the opportunity to, and then it doesn't, right? It sort of doubles down on something. The books are falling. There's a ghost with us. The sequel kind of doubles down on like the wrong thing or something, or the wrong thing.
Yeah, like on just like the lonely, isolated, betrayed. Yeah.
So my pick for a movie that is ripe to be fully queered, right? This is a movie from the late 50s, so right in the heyday of like aliens, sci-fi, nuclear, what have we wrought, and it's a retelling of I Married a Monster from Outer Space. Right, and it's sort of that famous sort of it's a doubling movie where a husband is now acting strange towards the wife, no longer affectionate, everything, and there's always been that queer subtext to it, and I think it's a perfect candidate to have that pushed forward and made that full text, and it's also interesting because the lead actor in that was a horror writer himself, and also a queer man. So,
interesting. Who was that?
Tom Tryon.
Okay, Cara, you have something?
I've been racking my brain. It's like the question was so specific. I actually was also thinking of Suspiria and the remake, partly because I just rewatched it, but
that ending
specifically,
that ending is so
I wish that what we had gotten was a full remake of the Three Mothers trilogy. I wish that director had been able to remake Inferno and Mother of Tears as well, and like explore the relationships between women, and also just kind of update like the figure of the witch, like the iteration of the witch as it appears in the Three Mothers is this very like folkloric, quintessentially female figure, and so there's a lot to explore about like what does the malevolent female figure look like in 2023, like right now, what is what does a witch even look like?
Right.
And so, yeah, I wish that we had just gotten like a whole trilogy remade to go with Suspiria, because it was so great. It was a great remake.
Although, The Mother of Tears wasn't that great. I wish it were better.
No, it was terrible. It has its charms, for sure, but partly because the quality was so poor, especially on the third movie. Like an update would have been great.
Those are the movies to remake.
Mm-hmm.
Those are the movies to remake, the ones that just aren't great, that have the potential for something, right? And I think that's we need Luca to save us and to come and rescue those movies and reimagine them. Suspiria remake is so great.
And I don't think it made enough money to ever
lead
to sequels.
No, it didn't. And I don't know that it got sort of a cult status that would warrant anything else with it later, but never say never, I guess, right?
I was just going to say, someone remake the Dead Ringers remake would be really great.
Addie and I had lots of texts about the Dead Ringer show. There was a lot of caps. She would send me lots of caps messages. Did anybody else?
I did a live hate.
Let's watch it.
Live.
Oh, you hated it. Interesting.
I did a Twitter thread, a live hate Twitter thread of it. Oh yeah, I think it absolutely.
I pushed Addie to do it, I think. And then you really ran with it. Yeah, I think, we don't want to turn this into the spoiler hour, but I think that it Addie could probably say more about it, obviously, but I think it just sort of did that thing where it kind of like betrayed sort of the like sort of these touchstones of the original movie. Like a gender swap is not enough, right? And that's important too, to think about. Like you can't just say, oh, we'll make it 2 female gynecologists instead. And it's almost like that was supposed to be like, oh, this is fixing something inherently kind of creepy about the first film by making it 2 sisters instead, right? But that's not true either. It just sort of made a new series of complications that kind of diluted something about the original. Yeah. Addie could go on, but
I'll just say that it just really leaned into what I find to be really harmful representations of twins. That I think, even though the original Dead Ringers, which I wrote about in the book, isn't completely disconnected from those tropes. I think that they're way more complicated in that film in a way that they aren't in most of media around twins, especially horror. Yeah.
Yeah. I can't remember if this was my answer last year when I asked it, but I am just obsessed with, / if anybody, any producer is out there in the audience who wants to let me do it. I think that Cronenberg's The Brood needs, it's so ready for a queer version of this, it's so hard to talk about without spoiling, although it sounds silly to say that you're going to spoil a film that came out 40 years ago, but just where it leads and what it builds up to in terms of body horror and its really unique vision of how one can procreate and create offspring, and what is born of extreme anger and emotion and rage, right? How sort of one's sort of internal workings can create something that lives outside of them. Just feels like really, maybe because I think about my own experience with my child being born via surrogacy and all that came with that, and sort of the weird realities and surrealities of that process. I just watched The Brood and I think about it so differently post that experience. I revisited it about 1.5 years ago and was just really taken by it in a way that I wasn't when I watched it the first time, probably when I was 9, which wasn't a good a good time to really get to that deeper understanding of the film. Which brings me to my next question for everybody. It's been several years. So those of you who are watching, in case you don't know, It Came From the Closet is 25 essays, 26 if you live in the UK. This is the UK edition. And it's queer and trans writers writing about a specific film. Sometimes there's a bit of cheating and there's 2 films being discussed. But thinking about a specific film or films that shaped or through which we think about our queer identity or an experience through the lens of that film. And sometimes it's like a reciprocal process of understanding the self in the film differently. And sometimes it's really just sort of strange parallels that occur between the film and the writer's experience. And sometimes it's just a really surprising reading of that film and how it connects to or challenges the queer experience in some way. So I'm wondering, the book's been out a year, but everyone sent me their essay in some form now many years ago, 3 years ago, 4 years ago, right? With some of you, we went through deep editing and rewriting experiences, and others it came sort of fully formed. And so what I wonder is, now that the book has been out and it's been several years since you even sat with that film and wrote it, I'm curious about how you think about that film that you wrote about all this time later, after having gone through the experience of writing your essay. And in turn, after sitting with that experience of writing the essay, has it made you think again about the experience that you wrote about, or the experiences that were put into conversation with the film, if that makes sense? So basically, what's changed since you sat with and visited that film in order to write your essay? Has something been reinforced? Has something radically changed? Can you never watch the film again because you spent so much time thinking and writing about it? Or do you find yourself drawn to it again and again because, was the writing of the essay just another way to watch the film and revisit it? And, you're never going to get sick of Sleepaway Camp or Nightmare on Elm Street, because how could anybody get sick of those movies, right?
You can't.
You can't, yeah.
Yeah, I can start. So the hero in Nightmare on Elm Street learns to face up to the monster. So I think that's it's common to a lot of horror, but it's something that I've been sitting with because life can be scary at times. And so I try to actualize that bravery and think, well, what happens if I look something, for example, like homophobia or transphobia in its current state? What happens if I talk to someone about that face to face? And what might happen, because in Nightmare on Elm Street, it doesn't ultimately turn out very good in that first movie. I mean, there are sequels, which means that the monster is not completely dead at the end. And that's what happens too when you confront homophobia and transphobia. Like, the person may say, okay, but that's still going to come back. It's going to resurface, right? And another thing I've been thinking about totally differently, narratively, about this movie. When I sat down to think about the movie, I played it very slowly and watched every scene and started to try to string together the story, and realized it does not make a lot of sense, which is part of what makes it scary, I think. Like, chronologically, it doesn't make sense. There are missing days in the middle of it. The parents' and teachers' reaction makes no sense. And also just the villain's backstory does not make sense. So that was just interesting to me, because I always had this assumption that when a story is really sticky in the mind, it must have some kind of like hero's journey structure to it. Like, it's got to have a beginning, middle, and end that really follows and makes sense. But in this case, it doesn't. Like, it's something else that makes it sticky.
Well, for me, I will always have a special place in my heart for Sleepaway Camp, and it's something that I will recommend wholeheartedly to everyone who hasn't seen it. Like, when people ask me, "Oh, what would you recommend?" I say, "Well, what do you like?" And then I will always just admit, this is one of my guilty pleasures, right? I realize with all my being that, on the face of it, it's not that great of a movie, right? Like, and as I mentioned in my essay, right, it is very problematic in many different ways, and yet, I guess one of the ways in which I've thought about it more and thought, and I guess this actually ties into what Joe was saying about the brood, but thinking about what does one do with queer rage, right? Like with anger, right? That we all sort of it's something that we have to sort of confront within ourselves, right? When faced with all the terrors and horrors of the real world, right? How do we find an outlet for that, right? And I'm not saying that we should go either the brood route or the sleepaway camp route, but I think it does sort of make us think of ways in which we can channel that rage, right? Whether it's beneficial or sort of maybe beneficial for us, but like detrimental to to others.
I can go. So Dead Ringers is just an incredibly important film to me as somebody who's lived as an identical twin and has been projected on, and we came of age in the 90s where media was just proliferating with these twin tropes, these twin stereotypes. And so even though Dead Ringers is a really heightened exaggeration of some of the issues that twins face, the reason that I really love that film is because it does really actually address the sort of complexity, difficulty of enmeshment versus individuation that I do think like most twins live with. But I kind of want to talk a little bit about having seen Tegan and Sarah's adaptation of their collaborative memoir, which is called High School. It's only had one season so far, but Tegan and Sarah were very much involved in the production of that show. Obviously, has nothing to do with horror, but they cast actual twins, and they cast twins that actually don't have a lot of acting experience. They're like TikTok stars. And I had a really intense personal reaction to that show in a way that I've just never felt so was so poignant for me. And I think it had to do with the fact that these were actual twins and not twins played by one actor. And so to me, they're related because they sort of proved like how powerful media can be when it sort of distances itself from these sorts of tropes. And then the other thing I'll say is just that I've had quite a few people write me who have read the essay in the book. And the most common thing that is said to me is that it has never occurred to them that there could be twins who might actually watch Dead Ringers, that like when they watch Dead Ringers, the idea of actual twins just doesn't even occur to them. And to me, that's just kind of like proves the sort of power of media, but also the way that I don't know. I think the way that these sort of like horror tropes that are based on like lived experiences are so far removed from people. I mean, it's obvious like most people have met somebody who's a twin, but I think that that's like a really interesting reaction. And the response to my essay is like, oh, I really loved all the essays in the collection, but like yours is like so deeply personal and like really fascinating to me because I didn't even think twins would ever be watching something like Dead Ringers. So yeah, so I think that that's like really powerful for me, but also really powerful for like readers thinking through like what horror is and like who are the real people, like in the queered and like transphobic and other things too, right? That sort of spans across the collection.
For me, there's something very specific. So my piece is about sort of using the blob as a figure in horror to talk about like the experience of being a physical creature and like the fact that one can be observed but never really known by other people, kind of about like embodiment and interpolation. And I say very confidently that what the blob offers is intimacy without legibility, not the eternal separation of annihilation, but just the opposite, the end of solitude. And I don't think that's actually true. I mean, they're not necessarily true. So just thinking about, I do talk about two films to kind of get at this idea. And while what I said here may be true of some blob figures in horror and in other media, it's not true in the films that I talk about. Maybe symbolically, but what literally happens on screen in The Blob is that the blob dissolves and devours, human bodies. It doesn't literally annihilate them. And then in society, the blob creatures are capable of this fantastical, extreme intimacy with each other. But if they perform that same act with a human person, it does kill and annihilate the person. So what the blobs are really doing on screen is kind of teasing us with the promise of, especially in society, teasing the viewer with the promise of this amazing, unthinkable kind of intimacy, but reminding us that it's not possible for us as actual creatures, and kind of driving home the fact that each of us is ultimately alone. And, we can only seek imperfect intimacies.
And does that still feel as true for you when you wrote the essay as it does now? Or does it feel like more complicated for you? Or I'm curious.
Oh, yeah. I mean, it just seems like that's the human condition, right? It's like not even close to the first person who's observed this or who's observed it, and people, obviously philosophers have observed it in a much more analytic depth,
Right.
But like that is the human condition, right? You can't experience another person's experiences. You can't know another person. It's the fact of sort of consciousness, the fact that we're these contradictory beings, we're physical beings that are conscious, but we can't experience another person's personhood. We do have to trust other people to express and enact their own personhood.
Right. And we fail at that a lot, unfortunately.
I guess it's interesting that part of that is that that consciousness versus physicality divide, right? We can experience another person's physicality, right? And that's part of what I think society is playing at. But it's not as if the consciousnesses merge at that moment, right? So it's like a full sublimation of the physical self that I guess these blob movies sort of examine.
Yeah. And I think that also factors in a bit to why so many of us who would never harm another human being can watch a horror movie and not feel, you might get squeamish when Ghostface comes and guts somebody, or Freddy comes through the bed and creates a whirlpool of blood. But because there's sort of this there's that you can't experience the pain of others, and then when it's done in such a fantastical sort of escapist way, it's so many places removed from real pain in some, right? Even like the most wrenching, realistic seeming horror movies tend to have something about them that is just a notch too far, that feels unrealistic, and thus we make peace with our enjoyment of watching it, right? So I think there's something there in that barrier to experiencing the experience and the pain of somebody else that actually makes horror like a doable thing to watch a horror movie and enjoy it so much, right? I don't know if that makes a ton of sense, but I'm just sort of making that connection a little bit.
I was also wondering. Oh, I'm sorry. I was just wondering too if Joe had an answer to the question.
Oh yeah. Well, and this connects to it too. I probably have one of the few essays in the collection that when I speak to people, when they meet me at events, or I get messages from readers, like nobody has seen the movie Grace. Like it's really one of the most, well, of course you have yet, but and now I trust that many people have seen it because of the anthology. But I'll hear, I've not seen it. Loved your essay, very moved by it, but I still haven't seen it. Or in some cases, they tell me they don't feel the need to see it, not because I ruined the movie and spoiled it, but because the parts of that film, which are pretty mid, I mean, the movie's not great. Like, it's okay. It's a movie that would have been great with like another $2 million or something, right? Like it needed a bit more of something to it. But the story is, for content warning, pregnancy loss and zombies. They basically the protagonist, the lead, Madeline, has had a series of miscarriages, and she is finally very pregnant with a child that she very much wants, and sort of adapts this very rigorous vegan lifestyle and is doing it all to be super healthy, supplements, and is just trying to really, really care for her body because she's so afraid of losing the pregnancy. And then in a cruel twist of fate, she and her husband get into a car accident. The husband dies and the baby dies in utero. And she decides to wait until her body naturally expels the child, because at some point it's not labor anymore. It's just your body reacting to foreign object that is making you sick. And so she pushes it a little too far. She gives birth and then insists on feeding the corpse of the baby, and the baby reanimates, and suddenly she has her baby. And then in about 20 minutes or so, the movie becomes a very schlocky vampire zombie baby who needs blood instead of milk. And so for me, the part leading up to zombie baby is painfully realistic. And so I think because I draw on that so vividly and connect to it, though I certainly spend time with and analyze the more surreal horror elements of it, it was that realistic horror, that like body horror, in the most sincere of ways, that haunted me and drew me to it. And so I wonder if some people just don't want to watch it because they know that what they will be in for is something that you don't traditionally see in a horror movie, and that most or many people don't want to endure or sit through in order to get to the fun stuff, right? Midway through the movie when it makes that sort of second act switch on us. So I get a lot of, I haven't seen it or I haven't seen it yet. Occasionally someone will tell me that they have seen it as a result of reading my essay, but I think that it's it's one of those instances where I feel like I may have driven people away from potentially watching the movie, which is an interesting thing and not what I intended to do. So for me, the movie remains as it was, and quite difficult to watch and write about. I was sort of a chicken about writing my essay and using it. There's even a moment where I was like, maybe I don't need an essay. I'm the editor. I do the intro. It's fine. And I'm glad that I pushed through. And I was being avoidant because I knew that I would write about Grace. So I still, and I've had the opportunity to watch it in screenings a few times at events, which has been a very interesting thing to watch people see it for the first time. But something about people in the audience laughing at scenes is actually kind of a good thing because it kind of breaks some of that tension and reminds me that the movie is at its core kind of silly. And so then it brings me back to like my reading is a personal one and it's emotional, but also, to know that not everybody is going to sort of experience it the same way, maybe because, although I don't know, it's very possible that any birthing person who watches it would completely, recoil. Part of my experience from it too is, being both like so outside of the pregnancy experience, being a cis man who cannot carry a child, but someone who facilitated and wanted a child through surrogacy, which is a very, sort of like you're beside the person who is doing it for you and trying to empathize with whatever they're going through, because they're doing you a big favor and you're borrowing their body. So you're in this like weird in between space where you cannot experience their physicality, but you have a stake in their physicality because within it is your child. So it's a very strange thing. So Grace is not about surrogacy, but I sort of view it from that perch. So I think
question for you. Do you think one of the reasons why people when they write to you and saying like, well, I don't need to see the film, right? Do you think one of the reasons might be because it is a child death, right? Because that's still one of the it's still high up there in terms of horror taboos, right? You very, very rarely see, like, well, you see like, teenage, preteen, but like very rarely see death or of like young children, like toddlers, and well, I take that back, Pet Sematary, but but newborns, right? That's
I was just on a podcast talking about Pet Sematary, and we were discussing the sort of radicalness of Gage being hit by that truck and only being 2, and that actor Miko Hughes being so exceptional at playing zombie Gage later, and how like what a thrill that is, but also how disturbing. And some of that was the taboo of it. I mean, the remake of Pet Sematary swaps the children to give you the older child who gets killed. And I feel
like it doesn't hit as hard.
Not at all.
Yeah, it doesn't have the impact.
Not at all.
Not to say that one wouldn't be devastated no matter which child had in real life, but there's something about the original that still,
But that's that weird thing about how we respond in some ways to some death on screen and not others. So I think that's it. But I think you're onto something that we don't often see, like the like a stillbirth in horror as like something about it feels. But that also factors into the fact that miscarriage and pregnancy loss and stillbirths are just not discussed. We just don't talk about them very much in our society to begin with, and that's sort of changing slowly. But in general, it's been a thing that people don't want to sort of discomfort other people with, so they don't talk about it. But it's so common and so recurring. So it might be that. It might be that there's sort of this, that if one is watching Grace, especially if it's been spoiled in the essay as it is, pretty early on where it's going. And so it's like, well, I don't want to watch a movie where like a woman, has got a stillbirth, like that's. So even if it shifts into something more conventional later, I just don't want to pay the price of admission to get there, right? Like it's not like the top of mind, but it might also not be top of mind because we are so weird about pregnancy loss and don't want to admit that, babies die, children die, right? To tie it back to, the horrors of war that are happening right now. Like there's a real like sort of refusal and denial to admit that this happens, right? Like I find myself having to like, let me look at all these, baking videos and comedy skits to sort of get these algorithms to rejigger themselves. So I'm not suddenly faced with, a father holding their dead child, because that's what's coming at us right now on TikTok. Right. So maybe that might be it. I think that's part of it, but also it's just not a movie that people know, and sometimes we don't seek out sort of B grade zombie baby movies, I guess.
So I guess
I do, of course, but
of course. So I guess that leads us into sort of the Q&As we're getting, right? So speaking of like of dead children, we have one question that asks what horror movie is most tied to or reminds us of a queer awakening, of age awakening in general.
Interesting.
For looking for someone to jump in, I can real quick give an unconventional answer. I might say The Dark Crystal by Jim Henson, which is really a fantasy movie. But because they are Jim Henson Muppets, I understand them as being queer coded. I think all the characters are queer coded. And there are monsters, but even more so than like the bug monsters that come and grab people. The message of that movie is really about the split of good and evil. Like originally we were whole beings, and we split into binaries. Some creatures are entirely good, some are entirely evil, and the goal is to somehow reconcile our selves, which are sort of our real selves, but also not really our real selves. So it's all about projections and binaries. So insofar as that is a monster movie, I would say The Dark Crystal was central for me.
And I'm going to follow with another Henson project, which is Labyrinth, which was actually, and it doesn't really seem scary now, but I was, a child when I saw that movie, and Bowie in that movie was like really informative to my like understanding of my gender, but didn't obviously realize it until much later. I'll also add, which is not a film, which is I was a huge Anne Rice Vampire Chronicles obsessed teen, and I feel like it's a very it's within the queer horror genre, I believe. Yeah.
For me, it's not a piece of horror media, but it is a monstrous figure, and that's the figure of the Trunchbull in Matilda. I was like 6 or 7 when the film came out. I watched the film before I read the book, and there are a lot of ways in which the Trunchbull, I think, is relatable to children in general, because she's kind of an overgrown child and how she acts on screen, but also just, she's this embodiment of what girls and women are not supposed to be. And, as a little kid, there was a lot, I wouldn't have been able to articulate it, of course, but there was a lot of that I saw of myself in the Trunchbull, even more so than in the child protagonist.
For me, I would have to go to my essay, and I would have to say like Sleepaway Camp was that formative queer experience for me, right? Just because, even as a younger child, teenager, I was consuming all the horror stuff, right? I think all the kids who grew up in the 80s, had their pile of Stephen King books, right? So, but it wasn't camp that for me, that was the first time I'd ever seen not a homosexual, but a homosexual couple relationship depicted in a horror movie, right? So that was sort of eye-opening, because before, when you have the figure of the homosexual, right, it's usually just one character, and they don't make it through to the end of the film, right? But here it was my first depiction of, I would say for a while, like a stable gay relationship, right? And it was a surprise, and it was also, like something that started making me think about horror more and what horror does.
Yeah, this is a good question. I feel like for me it's complicated in the sense that like I was so I think I sort of fed off the energy of like my very straight brothers when I watched horror with them, that I was so like excited. I was just waiting for breasts all the time, just waiting for breasts all the time. I just wanted nudity in horror, and horror always delivered it. And I remember being just sort of like, so it was sort of like a sexual like awakening watching it. I mean, I guess it just means I was like a pervy kid who wanted to watch nudity in horror movies, but slowly, the connection that I was feeling towards it was like less about the nude female figure and more about the male response or interaction or tension with the female body. And that slowly, you know, I realize now was was sort of an awakening about my desire to sort of like not inhabit that the male figure in those scenes, but to maybe sort of replace and, you know, step into the female figure a bit. And then more consciously, I feel like Sleepaway Camp for sure, but really, you know, the horror movie that I rewatched the most probably as a kid was the original Nightmare on Elm Street. And I think it was, you know, Nancy felt like sort of the perfect girl to me, but not one that I wanted to be romantic with, but one that I really identified with. And, you know, she was so pretty, but the boys were so pretty too, right? And Freddie was so not pretty. So there was sort of this like, there's an aesthetic to that original film just in the way, you know, even Rod, who's like, looks like he's 40 years old in the movie, but is supposed to be 18. Like, there's something about the way there's something about the aesthetic and how everybody's lit and how sort of, you know, soft, even the, you know, gritty, you know, Rod is, that, you know, feels, which feels purposeful. I feel like Wes Craven probably knew what he was doing because he wanted to, you know, sort of evoke that sort of the halo of innocence around everybody. There's a lot of like fog in that movie and a lot of sunlight, right? And a lot of moonlight. And he's doing a lot to sort of capture innocence where he can. So yeah, I kind of think Elm Street was the sort of natural progression of that, you know, sort of horny kid thing that was happening when I was first watching those movies when I was young, you know?
So Elm Street 1 and not 2. Interesting.
Yeah, well, that's the thing. 2 was totally over my head when I was watching it. I just knew I didn't like it as much because there was no Nancy. There was no final girl. I would skip right to 3. I would go right to 3 because I wanted her back. So it wasn't until I was much older that I realized what was going on in 2, you know?
Okay, we have another question.
Yeah.
Is there a movie or story that you consider queer horror that surprises people?
I want to consume all the queer horror is the parenthetical. Good questions. That speaks to queer coding a bit, right? Like, or a queer reading of a film. Let me think.
I guess part of me wonders what does surprise mean, right? Is surprise as in I did not expect that to be queer? Is it surprise as in I didn't know that this movie existed, or surprise as in, you know, like, that came out of nowhere?
Well, I guess it could mean all the above, but my sense is that the question might mean like when you share a queer reading of it or call it queer or consider it queer horror, the other person is surprised because they didn't view it that way or didn't think about it that way. Right? Does that sound?
Yeah.
I feel like that might be the way the question is being asked.
I would volunteer Invasion of the Body Snatchers because it's about having your body cloned with not having a soul in it. So exactly how that process happens is often not very clear. There was an original and a remake. There might have been multiple remakes. The actual physical process of what happens to your body is not clear, but what is absolutely clear is that you will be a robot. and I think that it's, to me, it speaks to the demand for conformity. Like people saying, you were given this body by God or nature, and you should behave however we want you to behave. And it doesn't matter what you feel on the inside. So I've always seen that as being very much about conformity. And that, I think, lends itself to a lot of different queer readings.
I would go for a more familiar film, right? That, or maybe less familiar, but one that, if once you've watched the entire thing and not just like the 30-second highlights reel, which everyone knows, is Bride of Frankenstein. 100%, right? Just because, up until the creation of the bride, right? There's, Dr. Pretorius is he's so gay, and I think there's a little bit of that camp element, and I think it's unavoidable when we're talking about like a film by James Whale, right? All of his films had that little bit of queerness to it, right? Like not only Bride of Frankenstein, but like This Dark Old House had plenty of it. So yeah, I'd say if you haven't seen Bride of Frankenstein all the way through, you'd be surprised at just how much is there.
I want to say The Fly for thinking about transness and transformation, especially because his character is choosing to do the thing that then is becomes much more complicated. So, which I've never.
The bird fly, right?
Yeah.
I can't really. I don't know. I don't really have a good answer. I mean, I'm just thinking about the film Christine. Christine is often read as about repressed homosexuality, but I think that it's probably not surprising. But I do think that there's a trans reading also of Christine, where the main character is sort of sublimating or expressing through the car. I mean, the car is gendered female, expressing his gender identity through the car. And that part of why he can't be intimate with either the female love interest or with his friend is because he can't really properly be intimate with either as a boy or as a man, that there's this repressed womanhood that's expressed through the character. She really is a character through the character of Christine. She's part of him.
I'm going to rewatch Christine now, thinking about that, because I actually have never. That was a movie that I saw a lot as a kid, but don't remember it very well, aside from a few key moments. So now I'm curious to revisit it, thinking about that, because I haven't.
I want to ask you a question. Have you seen the movie Titan? The French
I
film?
haven't seen it yet. I've heard so much about it, but I haven't.
Christine's sister, right?
Exactly. I'd be curious to hear how, in light of what you said about Christine, how you read that film.
Oh, well, I'll have to check it out sooner rather than later then, I think.
Yeah. I think in honor of my bromance shirt that I'm wearing right now, I'll say that a lot of people are often surprised when you bring up just how sort of homoerotic the ending of Scream is with Billy and Stu. Just their body language, like Stu's got his face buried into Billy's back and he's just so excited, and they're just so, the sexual energy is popping all over the place. It's there should have been another Jiffy Pop on the stove that's just going off by itself in that scene. And then just the way they're just psyching themselves up for the penetration, but and just the, they think that penetrating each other, stabbing each other is going to feel different than it does, and they're surprised when it's so brutal, and they're not, they're just not ready for it, and it's very I don't know, it's super sexual. And I think that people are often like, what? No. And then you remind them gently that Kevin Williamson is a gay man, and you remind them gently to go back and see it, and just how the delight they're taking in killing their girlfriends and getting rid of the women. And, it just, it's definitely all there. And that to me is a prime, yes, you can sort of just ignore that and think, oh, that's silly, or that's that crazy queer agenda again, right? Or you can sit back and enjoy it and sort of allow yourself to watch those final 25 minutes in that way. And I think it really changes. It gives a theory, at least, right? It gives a little extra something too. And also just the way Billy is so just the slut shaming, and the fact that, the reason for what he does and what he did to Sydney's mother is just so like, dude, how repressed and puritanical can you be? And sort of his obsessive like insistence that he has to get into Sydney's pants the whole movie, right? Just his like, he's wearing his libido on his white sleeve the whole time. And it's just so aggro. It's so much. It's so performative alpha. And again, Skeet Ulrich is such a pretty boy in that movie. So it's like just another like instance of like Wes Craven really knew how to like frame like a teenage boy to like, kind of almost mock them in their desire to be masculine, right? And sort of make them always feel a little bit,
Oh, I do. Sorry. I still thinking about the question. I was thinking about The Omen obviously is an iconic horror film, but its sequels are probably lesser known and mostly not great. But The Omen 2 is a really interesting film that recenters Damien. So in the first movie, Damien has no agency or subjecthood at all. He's just a little kid that may as well not be a character. But in the second movie, he's a pubescent teenager, and it follows him as a character. It's a little more of a drama about this boy coming to understand who he is. And there's a lot in his relationship with his cousin that, I think that he's framed as a potentially queer character, and that there's this kind of tragic attraction to his cousin, tragic because of how the film transpires. And for films that, again, it's not overt, but for films with queer subtext and films about arguably queer characters, I think The Omen 2 kind of flies under the radar because The Omen is not known for having really quality sequels. And it doesn't necessarily work that great as a horror film, but as like a drama that, again, recenters the story really interestingly, where Damien is both the antagonist and the protagonist. It's really about his interiority and development. It's worth checking out, I think.
Is it Sam Neill playing the adult?
That's Omen 3.
So Omen 3.
Okay.
Omen 3 has
that one.
Sam Neill as an adult Damien. I don't know the actor's name, but it's this very like vulnerable, small, expressive teenage boy playing Damien in the second movie.
Interesting. So I think I don't remember 2, but I remember 3 pretty. Okay, I'll have to go watch 2.
And it also takes place at a military academy, which is probably
queer. A lot of masculinity happening in the movie.
Laurie's here, but we can't hear you.
You're muted. You're muted.
Thanks, y'all. You started talking about The Omen, and I instantly was like, American Horror Story, Apocalypse, because there's that plot line, storyline, and it just Ryan Murphy's ridiculous, fantastical, and just right back to ridiculous all at the same time. All right. Thank you all so much for joining us tonight. And one last question. Let's say someone feels intimidated by horror. Where do you recommend a queer reader to start?
Oh, I mean, generally when I get the question of what would you recommend, part of me is always asking, well, what have you liked so far, right? Because the question is, there's so much to horror. Where does one begin?
I think you
tackle a different genre.
Well, I think you have to know yourself a bit and what you can handle, right? You don't want to sort of have you don't want to dive into the deep end and totally traumatize yourself with something that is too much. I know that it's not necessarily considered like, if we're talking about horror writing, you really can't go wrong with Stephen King. And I think that like just going to Carrie is a really, because it's such a, I'm pretty sure it's his debut, right? I could be wrong, but it's definitely at least a very, very early Stephen King. And it's just not like difficult to endure. It's well written. It's interesting. The story of Carrie is really iconic, but it's not like as difficult to maybe turn through like Pet Sematary or something like that, right? So Stephen King, though quite, he's mainstream and iconic for good reason, I think. But I think, you be gentle with yourself if you're not sure, because sometimes you can sort of accidentally encounter something that will really turn you off or make you feel like, oh, I can't do any horror. And that's, you got to kind of build up to it, right? It's like exercise. You have to like do a little more each time, and then you'll be running that marathon before you know it. I can't run a marathon, but
Well, and I also
you
think
support
like
the
if you
analogy.
want to go softer, you could go with Shirley Jackson. You could start with Gothic, and then
Yes.
go deeper, depending on how you relate to it too. So
No, I think that's a
Another
great
approach.
suggestion because, The Haunting is one of those films that has that delightful queer subtext running all the way through it. Right? I mean, I still love Theodora as a character, right? So I'm going to go the opposite direction. And once you're ready to step up from Stephen King, I would say start checking out some of the works of Clive Barker, right? Like his Books of Blood series, and
super queer.
If you're looking at his movies, something like Nightbreed, is a great entree into sort of a queer horror specifically.
Yeah.
An approach that comes to me is that you could watch a film that's very recent, because there's just going to be a lot of discourse about it in the newspapers or on social media, which is kind of like watching a movie with a friend. I mean, you can watch an old movie with a friend and talk about it, but watching a new movie, it might speak to our current moment in some way. So something that comes to me is like the movie Nope, which is considered sci-fi also. It's about UFOs and just how people are reacting to seeing UFOs that they think might be watching them, or they like try to chase the UFOs. It's very quirky, and I think it's not entirely horror. You could read it in a lot of different ways, but that is just something that comes to me as like because horror evolves, and if something like in the past feels like, oh, the bulk of the horror canon is in the past, and it feels somehow inaccessible because it's speaking to some anxieties from some other decade, you could watch the horror made in this decade and it might resonate differently.
That's a good idea.
On top of everything else that everyone else has said, I think that the fact that horror is so expansive is exactly a reason not to feel intimidated by it, because there are any number of ways that you can enter into it. So you could definitely check out canonical texts. It's great advice to check out recent texts. Also, if you do like know what you like already, there's horror stories about every subject you can imagine. So like if you really like Jurassic Park because you like stories about scary creatures, you can check out Creature Features. If you're interested in queer stories about queer characters and identity, you can definitely check that out specifically. If you really like looking at jewel tones, you can check out Suspiria, the original Suspiria. There's any number of if you know yourself enough to know what it is that compels you generally, you'll be able to find a horror story about it.
Great.
Awesome. And with that, I'm going to encourage everyone at home, go read some more horror, but most importantly, purchase your copy of It Came from the Closet, or check it out from your local library. We're big library fans here at Busboys and Poets too. And Joe has it. Honestly, Joe, can you like raise your t-shirt and like
yeah, this is an artist called Small Town Weirdo, Adam Bucci, and he makes these amazing very like Jersey Shore boardwalk.
The pure delight I had
threads.
when it comes out that the homoerotic like vibes I was getting on the money. I was just like, yes.
You're right.
It's almost
trust your gut.
Yeah, exactly. It was a storyline I wish we had gotten, like the subplot in the Heathers, but only so much.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you all so much at home. Have a good rest of your evening. Thank you all so much to our guests, and have a spooky, safe, and lovely Halloween, everybody. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Lori.
Thank you.
Good to see you all.
Thank
Thank you.